and thus the inaugural FIFA tournament was hosted in 1930. Because Uruguay was the best team, the back-to-back champions of the Olympic tournament, it was FIFA decided that the World Cup would be hosted in Uruguay. The 1930 World Cup would be hosted in Uruguay. Now, as you can imagine, for something of this scale, right? The first tournament, that 1930 tournament, was shambolic. It was shambolic. This one was strictly by invite, so there was no qualification process. But the choice of Uruguay as a venue for the competition meant a long and costly trip for the European teams, right? Which, remember, they were just dealing with the Great Depression at the time. So no European country actually pledged to send a team until 2 months before the start of the tournament, when then FIFA president Rime sort of prodded them to come. And ultimately of Belgium, France, Romania, and Yugoslavia who came. And in fact, Uruguay, the small country of Uruguay, ended up subsidizing those trips. And ultimately, 13 nations participated in the World Cup. 7 from South America, 4 from Europe, and 2 from North America. Right? So where are the African teams here? Well, there was only one African team that was invited to this, and that was the Pharaohs of Egypt. Right? However, their boat coming from Africa, right, was slowed down due to a storm in the Mediterranean Sea, and they missed their connection, so they never made it to the World Cup. That's Africa's first foray into the World Cup, right? So the first World Cup was, even though 16 teams had been invited, ended up being just competed in by 13 teams, and of course Uruguay won that. And what would become a trend in those early years, Egypt was the only African team to apply to feature for the 1934 World Cup, which was held in Italy, in Mussolini's Italy, right? And this was the first World Cup with qualifiers. They were looking to get 16 teams over there, and since there were 32 teams qualifying, there was a round robin sort of established by FIFA through which they would qualify. Egypt was placed in a group with Turkey and Palestine, right? Turkey withdrew from this tournament, and Egypt just had to beat Palestine to qualify. So Egypt beat Palestine 7-1 in Cairo at home, and 4-1 in Jerusalem, the Holy Land. Beat them in the Holy Land. And so they qualified for the 1934 World Cup. So the first African team to qualify for the World Cup. So, and at the time, the World Cup was organized on a straight knockout basis, right? So Egypt played against Hungary in Naples, where they lost 4-2, with Abdul Rahman Fauzi scoring a brace. He scored 2 goals to become the first African player to score at the World Cup. He also scored a third, but it was disallowed even though he had dribbled the field from halfway, and still continues to be controversial to this day. But in any case, Abdul Rahman Fauzi scored 2 goals in the first match by an African team at the World Cup. They lost 4-2 to Hungary. And the significance of this, right? They wouldn't have known this at the time, but Egypt would be gone from the World Cup for 56 years after 1934. So do the math. They wouldn't play in the World Cup again until 1990, right? And African teams as a whole wouldn't play again in the tournament for another 36 years, 1970. But they had broken onto the world scene with my man Abdul Rahman Fauzi scoring twice. In 1938, what happens in that gap, that long gap with African teams? Well, let me take you there. In 1938, Egypt was again the only African country to apply to compete in the World Cup. But they withdrew before playing any matches. And here's why. It's a crazy reason. Egypt were supposed to play Romania in a qualifier for the World Cup in December of 1937. However, Egypt told FIFA, right, that this was during the month of Ramadan, the Islamic fasting month of Ramadan, and they didn't want to play the match during that month. And FIFA was sort of on the fence about this, right? Should we allow this? However, their chances of getting approved were blown out of the water, right? When Egypt invited Austrian side Vienna FC to play an exhibition match during the same fasting period. Think about that, right? So while FIFA is still mulling over the decision whether they should postpone the match because it's Ramadan, Egypt goes on and invites an Austrian team to play them during that. So the FIFA's like, oh, you can actually play, right? And after that, Egypt was ejected from the World Cup, from the World Cup qualification. So no African teams in 1938. Then, of course, 42, 46, the World Cup is suspended. I think there was a war or something happening. Hitler, Mussolini, Roosevelt, Churchill, and these guys. You might have heard about it. I think they call it the Second World War or something. No, but seriously, the Second World War was a big disruptor. And coming back from the World War, the first World Cup coming back from there was supposed to be held in 1949. But again, it was taking a little bit of time to prepare for it. So it was finally handed to Brazil in 1950. Again, because of how shambolic it was, and a lot of teams actually did not make it to this World Cup, right? Because a lot of countries were unprepared, still smarting from the war. Germany and Japan were banned. A lot of Italian players had died in an air crash, right? Several other teams such as the Soviet, the Czechs, Scotland, Turkey, France, all decided to pull out. Countries are still building from the Second World War. Interestingly, though, this was England's first World Cup appearance. They hadn't participated in the other World Cups because they did not want to play against the countries that they had fought against in the First World War. And also they just thought of the whole FIFA thing as a joke. This is our game. It's coming home. And all that nonsense. Shout out to my English subscribers, though. In any case, so no African teams participated in that tournament. 1954, Egypt was still the only African team that applied to compete at that World Cup. They had to play a playoff against Italy. They lost home and away, so they didn't qualify again. But 1954 is a pivotal year in the history of African football. At that year's FIFA Congress, Sudan, Egypt, Ethiopia, and South Africa, interestingly, who were then the only members of African members of FIFA, spoke about their plan to create CAF, the Federation of African Football. FIFA recognized them right there and then as one of the 6 regional zones, right? A lot of people weren't having it, and leading the charge was Argentina, who felt that the seats being given to Africa and Asia and FIFA were not reflective of the quality of football in those continents, right? They felt that so this was a big struggle. But in any case, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan all applied to enter the qualification process for the 1958 World Cup, right? Ethiopia's entry was rejected together with South Korea. Now, the reasons for this I couldn't really find. So that left 2 African teams to qualify. For the first time, we had more than one African country, more than just Egypt, qualifying for the World Cup. And it had initially been Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan. But Ethiopia was now out, so it was just Egypt and Sudan. Now, the qualification for the 1958 World Cup was beset with problems, right? A lot of them relating to Israel's participation. Now, I hear you asking, right? Israel's not in Africa. Why would this be relevant to this? Well, listen to this. Egypt and Sudan competed in the Africa/Asia zone with 10 Asian countries for one spot at the World Cup, right? So these 12 countries would be competing for one spot at the World Cup. At that time, Israel was classified as an Asian team and was drawn to play qualifiers within those 12 teams, right? Progressed to the second round of these qualifiers after Cyprus withdrew, then they themselves withdrew. Sudan also defeated Syria, but eventually withdrew in protest to having to play Israel. That's the same reason Egypt had withdrawn as well. Time and again, the Israeli opposition, and successively it was Turkey, Indonesia, Egypt, and Sudan withdrew, right? And what do those countries have in common? Turkey, Indonesia, Egypt, and Sudan. All majority Muslim countries, right? So they withdrew, refusing to play Israel on political grounds. If you can imagine, Israel at this point is no more than 10 years old, the modern state of Israel, and it's been lambasted by its neighboring states, as well as the large, of which Egypt is one such state, but also the global, particularly the Muslim community in the world, right? This is something that you may still run into even today. For example, Iranians are still forbidden from competing against Israeli opponents in any sport, right? And there was a recent wrestling case or something to this effect. So Israel therefore took the spot for the Asian African teams without having kicked the ball, right? Because all these teams refused to play them. But FIFA's rules prohibited any team that was not a host or a defending champion from qualifying without playing a game. So Israel ended up having to play against Wales, which was the best non-qualified team from Europe for that World Cup, and they lost to Wales. And Wales qualified to that World Cup in 1958, which was their last time at the World Cup until 2022. So fascinating stuff here. So again, no African teams at the World Cup in 1958.